Watching News at Prime, let's continue now with the focus on NSFAS. The Higher Education Minister, Nzimande's decision to dissolve the NSFAS board and appoint an administrator for the next year. Today, he attributed the move to the scheme's repeated inability to perform basic functions. Let's get some reaction now. And we're joined in studio by Sasco Secretary General Alungile Gamche, SAICA President Ganakana Muzanani, and social justice activist Busi Siabe. To all of my guests, good evening to you and thank you for joining me. Let's start with you, Mr. Muzanani. The decision to place NSFAS under administration, and let me include in that question the administrator. Do you have confidence that this decision is ultimately what is going to place NSFAS on the right footing from here on?
Good evening to you, Goliath. Good evening to your viewers as well, and thank you so much for having us here. I think, firstly, as a council, we acknowledge and welcome the minister's decision to dissolve the board. We believe that it's been long overdue, but we are also of the fundamental belief that much more still needs to be done in order to turn around the entity. And we have no doubt that the then leader of SAICA, Mr. Freeman Nomvalo, might be the right person to turn the entity around. But what is critical and what we want to put forward to South Africa is that we do not have confidence that under the stewardship of Minister Nzimande, as credible as Mr. Nomvalo is, he will have the ability to turn around the entity. Why do I say this, Toli? You will recall that NSFAS itself has been limping from one crisis to the other. The higher education sector on its own, any South African can attest to the fact that it's deteriorated to a much more shocking level. If you speak about NSFAS, any student at any university or TVET college will tell you that what it was in 2018, it's what it's no longer today. And what is even shocking, Cole, is that the minister is dissolving the board at the fact that it is unable to manage the disbursement of allowances to students, because there were 4 companies, Coinvest, Tenet, and other 2 companies as well, that were irregularly appointed and trusted with the responsibility to disperse these funds, of which they've decimally failed to do so. Yeah. What is even surprising is the fact that the then board-appointed Verksman's attorneys as well as Advocate Tembeka Nzukaitobi to do a forensic investigation as to was the appointment of those service providers done in a correct manner. And the forensic investigation recommended that the 4 companies must not be entrusted with that responsibility to disperse allowances. And that is something that is shocking, because I was listening to the minister at today's press briefing. He was stating that as much as the board has been dissolved, the very same companies that everyone is complaining about will continue with the responsibility to disperse allowances to students. So we believe that Mr. Nomvalo's first task, as soon as he takes over office, is to deal with the question of those appointed financial service providers and make sure that there is a direct system that was there prior to the appointment of these service providers, which was much more effective, much more ease, and not costly at all to students in institutions of higher learning.
All right, let's come to you, Mr. Gamche. He's given us a very nice summary of where things are now, but we have to track back in order to make progress. Those who made these appointments of these companies, I'm talking about the former CEO, Andile Nongoko. I'm talking about the former board chair now, who, interestingly, resigned on Friday, and subsequent to his resignation, we saw the dissolution of the board. Should those people be held accountable? And if so, what should be the penalty towards them?
No, thank you very much, Chloe. And everything now has become a suspect if you look at the events recently. And definitely, everyone who's been found on the wrong side of law should be held accountable for what has taken place in NSFAS. Because we don't want to, find ourselves experiencing such a catastrophe in the near future. But I should state it here, Goli, that direct payments was a policy proposition of Sasco. Remember that as a largest students' organization in South Africa, we do influence policy making and policy implementation in government. So we do feel that we've been failed in its implementation. Why? Because we discovered that later on it isn't direct. Actually, we still have the existence of middlemen who has to, disperse these allowances to students, and now causing an entire chaos because there's delays, there's charges, there's a lot that we've complained about. But it is a policy proposition that we developed. However, in the time being, we've resorted to saying now these allowances must be dispersed by the institutions of higher learning, noting the fact that institutions themselves are not immune to corruption, because we've had cases in the past where institutions would deal with these processes in a very in a way that would not be able to assist students, and that students would not be able to get their allowances on time, or sometimes that money is getting chowed by managers of the institutions of higher learning. So that's why we're skeptical about the longevity of this, because the minister said it's 4 months. We're looking for a lasting solution in terms of direct payments. That's what we're looking for.
Ms. Siabe, let's come to you. You are a social justice activist, and we remember you very well in the days of Fees Must Fall. I want to talk about the plight of students, because NSFAS is targeted at students who come from very poor backgrounds. I was listening to a list of them this afternoon that we spoke to as a channel. They talk about when NSFAS has not made payments into their accounts, they can't go back home to say, please assist financially, because they know that the parents have nowhere to go. And so they must stay and make some means to feed themselves and find a shelter. The situation of those students, how badly have they been failed?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think we must begin by clearly outlining that the changes going on in NSFAS at the moment are cosmetic changes. The major issue with NSFAS is Minister Nzimande himself and his failure to be able to effectively run the ministerial duties that he has to undertake as the Minister of Higher Education and Training. More than anything else, the current situation that is facing students is a very dire one. Students are unable to get textbooks in order for them to adequately participate in their own academic futures. Students are unable to feed themselves. They're unable to even get something as simple as cosmetics in order for them to be able to attend lectures. Students are being kicked out of residences because there is no payment in those accommodation facilities that they now occupy. And that is a very big issue, and it's disruptive to, the academic environment that universities and the Department of Higher Education and Training should be trying very hard to maintain and to facilitate. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that. What we are seeing, on the other hand, is we are seeing high levels of corruption that are not only coming from the minister's office himself, and I say this because of, the expose that was done by Outer that speaks to the fact that the minister himself is heavily involved in corruption, and in the corruption that led to about 47 billion rand, being dwindled and disappearing when CEO Andile was still in charge of the NSFAS fund. So we need to be able to look at, the causal effects of what NSFAS and its lack of being able to provide the services that it intended to provide and it was supposed to provide has meant for students. Students are sleeping in libraries. Students are sleeping at park stations, for an example. Students are unable to enter their classrooms and participate in the academic activities because they haven't been able to do their assignments. To a large extent, that also relates to them failing, and which becomes, a longer issue, because if they do end up failing, then they don't get funding for the next academic year, which means that they leave the institution of higher learning with incomplete degrees. Most of them, to a large extent, become financially excluded as well, because some universities are not as lenient as other universities, in the sense that if you're unable to pay for specific things, then you aren't able to access the institution of higher learning to begin with. Registration remains an issue. A lot of students are still not registered. We also have an issue around access. Students aren't able to access institutions of higher learning, let alone TVET colleges as well, because of the sheer number of people who are looking to get into higher education. So we are seeing a very dire crisis happening within the higher education sector, which is also bleeding into the basic education sector. But I'm hoping that's something that we'll be able to delve into a little bit later.
Yeah. In the interest of reporting factually, I, as a host, have to make sure that we do not make accusations that perhaps are yet to be proven. There are two investigations, as I understand it. So the one is that Mr. Gamche mentioned as to the hiring of the direct payment companies, these four companies he spoke about. Companies. Then the other one had to do with the allegations that monies were allegedly paid to the SACP, monies had possibly also been channeled towards the minister himself. Yes. I know that that was supposed to be some 30-day investigation by the current board that has now been dissolved. Do we know what the outcome of that investigation has been? Because if we're going to say the minister is corrupt, we must state it on the basis of fact.
I can definitely agree with you on the fact that we must base, a lot of what we utter on facts. But we also have to look at the fact that it is very convenient that this board is being dissolved now pending the outcome of that investigation, which means that a report on its own could end up in the wind and we never get to access it. What we need to be able to do is we need to have an independent body outside of the board or outside of even Freeman himself as an administrator currently to look at the financials of NSFAS and be able to trace exactly what happened to the money that has gone missing. Because the reality and the fact is 47 billion rand has gone missing. Where it's gone to is what we don't know. Who is involved is what we don't know. And we need an independent body to be able to investigate that so that we can hold the people who are responsible accountable, specifically ahead of elections. Because this dissolution of this board comes at a very strategic time, not only for the ANC government but also for the minister himself, with the hopes of going back to Parliament as a member of Parliament and also possibly going back as a minister. So we need to be able to look at those nuances within the current situation that we find ourselves in with NSFAS and look at how it ties back to the national elections, look at how it ties back to the reports that still have not been released, look at how it ties back to even, for an example, the Workman report that my colleague had spoken about that gave recommendations that the minister and the rest of the board completely ignored, which has put us in the situation that we're in today.
Mr. Mutsanana, let's come to you and very briefly, because we need to wrap this conversation now. Moving forward, I was talking to University South Africa CEO who says that there is a looming threat of unrest by students, and this is because universities now are faced with the task of doing these direct payments themselves, and she used the word messy. Where are things right now, and is there some truth to that threat of unrest?
After listening to Professor Matutu, I think it goes without saying, Kuli, that we need a much more sharper blade at the Department of Higher Education and Training that's going to deal with cutting barriers of entries that exist for the marginalized and those who come from much more poor backgrounds. I mean, for instance, CEO was there during Christmas fall, and she will tell you that the minister at the time was Minister Nzimande. I mean, when I came to university myself, he was the minister, and the problems that we are speaking about today are problems that we were speaking about at the time when Mr. Carlson was the chair of the board at the time. And under his administration, we've seen about 2 administrators being appointed to NSFAS. And I want to say, Koli, it's quite sad to have someone who projects himself to be a communist failing to understand the implications of not getting NSFAS to work in a manner which is much more correct. We live in South Africa, a society wherein higher education is a prerequisite for socio-economic and occupational advancement. Yeah. Without a degree or a post-school qualification in South Africa, it's extremely difficult to get a job. Now, when you do not make NSFAS work, the only tool that poor people can use to alleviate themselves from poverty, what you are ultimately doing is that you are reinforcing race, class, as well as gender inequalities. So we fundamentally believe as a council that President Ramaphosa and his government must understand that with Minister Nzimande at Higher Education and Training, we are condemning so many young people to a circle of poverty, and we need to do away with that. So as we go forward, we expect a new minister, a fresh and a much more younger board that will be in touch with the issues at higher education and what needs to be done to make sure that NSFAS works. And we are also interested in the synchronization of NSFAS and the a SASA company, so that it's not a mission for someone who is a SASA recipient, who does not have the ability to apply for NSFAS online to actually get funding when they matriculate from high school. So we believe that those are some of the interventions that are going to be there going forward.
Mr. Kamche, the questions to you are twofold, and please, if you can, be brief. The Minister of Higher Education, you have heard from Mr. Mutsanani. It's the second time that NSFAS is placed under administration under Minister Blaine Nzimande's watch. Secondly, you are the one who made a confession not so long ago that it was the policies that you pushed as Sasco, given your proximity to power, that's the ANC, those are the links that you have, you pushed for this direct payment system. And today, we sit here with the words you've used, with a failure. These companies, by the way, they have not yet been delinked because there is a legal process that has to unfold for them to be delinked so that they don't sue the very same NSFAS, which is possibly going to go belly up if they do that. How much responsibility do you take?
You know, what we need to realize at the very least is that we've thought this through, right? That when you have a situation that institutions of higher learning are embezzling these funds, there needs to be a method whereby government will be directly accountable. Now we're at that stage. Now that government has to be directly accountable. At least we're channeling the frustrations and our conversation with the government. Unlike institutions of higher learning that held by institutional autonomy, there's no certain level of accountability that we could place upon them. So
I need to when you say accountability,
yes,
it must be channeled towards government. What does that mean in practice?
It means everyone who's been involved in the shenanigans at NSFAS, everyone who has failed the progressive policy proposition must be held accountable. That's what it means. Beginning with the implementation of the Vexman's report, and now that we've seen and we welcome the dissolution of the board, because the board was plagued with infighting. The board was dysfunctional. The board was not executing anything.
But
so it had to be dissolved.
Who's at the helm of this? Who does NSFAS report?
The minister has dissolved the board. The minister had to dissolve the board. The board was dysfunctional. It was long overdue. So what we need to see here is a complete implementation of the Vexman's report, which will see the rooting out of corruption at NSFAS. On the other hand, the agency here is to serve students. That students must receive their allowances on time. Okay. That's what is needed. That's the agency.
Okay, I'm out of time. Perhaps you may be able to answer the question as to what does the accountability look like at government level? NSFAS is placed on administration for the second time.
Accountability looks like exercising our democratic, responsibility on the 29th of May. That's what accountability looks like. It looks like us going to vote in a government that will not do or dwindle or engage itself in corrupt activities to the extent that it threatens the futures of young South Africans in this country, that it threatens the futures of young people who are trying to economically develop themselves and self-actualize in a country that has a high unemployment, that has a high crime rate, that has high numbers of GBV, that basically gatekeeps access to higher education. So one thing that students need to be able to understand is that Sasco is not going to do anything for them at this particular point in time because of the fact that this policy proposal around the direct payment comes from them, and they have proximity to power, and they've not been able to use that proximity to power for the advancement or for the benefit of students. So we need to be able to exercise our democratic responsibility on the 29th of May. Whether you believe I lack understanding or not, the fact remains that we are in this position because of a failed policy proposition that your higher structure is unable to implement, which is something that they're unable to do across all boards. Basic education, higher education,
the EFFC proposed the same
intervene right here.
Of the ANC.
I have to intervene right here.
Thank you.
I could have allowed for this debate because it's one that South Africa needs. However, I'm completely out of time. So to all my guests, thank you very much for your time. Well, when we continue, we're going to get sports in a moment.